I wanted to start off here, if you could talk about your World War I diary of Jose de la Luz Sainz. If you could give us a little background on the man and why we should study this man and his diary, and what's unique about this diary?
It is the only, as far as I know, it is the only published diary of any war by a Mexican American. And it is also the only, and perhaps maybe the only one that was also published by a serviceman from Texas in World War I. And it is so many things in one. It is first and foremost, as he said in his diary, an attempt to document the experiences of all soldiers in situations of war. He became very anti-war, as most soldiers in the front become, because of the difficulties that they face. But it was more than that. It wasn't just an account of the difficulties that the soldiers faced in combat, and even in the rear, bored and tired and afraid. But it is also a very personal political statement by a Mexican-American civil rights leader who had already made a name for himself as a civil rights leader before he entered the war, and then became even more well-known after the war.
Mm-hmm. Do I understand correctly, was he instrumental, be part of the history of LULAC?
He was one of the founders of LULAC in 1929, and he was also one of the founders of the predecessor of LULAC, which was established in 1927, 2 years before the organization as we know it was formed in Corpus Christi. And before that, he was very actively involved with other civil rights leaders like Alonso Perales and Jose Tomas Canales, who went around the state speaking about the need for a civil rights movement that could speak to the problems of discrimination and inequality. So he did a lot of the prior work alongside these other very important figures. And then they proposed an organization, and they met, and they got support for them from various organizations throughout the state.
Mm-hmm. So if we were to kind of chronicle this individual, he talked about the home front, and he talked about what it was like to be in war. For our audience, can you kind of chronicle what kind of trials and tribulations, if you could take us through his world during that particular time that people may want to know about?
Well, he was an extraordinary person at different phases in his life. As a young boy, he was part of a very poor Mexican family living in a rural area. His father was a farm worker and occasionally a railroad worker who maintained tracks, the railroad tracks in the area of deep South Texas. His parents, the mother, we shouldn't forget the mother.
The jet again.
Yeah. The mother, should I stop or should
Yeah, just for a second.
Okay.
It makes it really difficult to get a clean audio.
I said this, your Mac will sleep soon unless plugged into a power outlet.
Give you some power for my charged here.
I just realized that was on. This thing's been going all day.
God, it's so slow.
Did you bring a...
I did bring a charger, but it's in, I think, my bag, so I don't know. I don't know if that, am I doing it wrong here? This doesn't seem to fit.
Maybe yours is newer than mine. Yep. This is different.
There should be one in my bag there. I think, anyway. I think I brought it up there.
Continue.
Pop this in here.
Sun's not blasting into the lens.
You want me to continue with the mom?
Cameras, I'm sorry. Let's see. Dang it. I have to move everybody now, unfortunately. Yeah, that's right, down the barrel. Vengeance. John, we'll move you to,
Okay.
and right up here next to the camera.
You want me to move?
Just have you face John a little. Actually, yeah, just if you can just turn your chair just slightly more towards John, that'd be great. Perfect. That's all we need.
Okay, now I'm not affected by this, but the sun is right in my face, just so you know.
Yeah.
I can ask the question. Okay, so I've got a little bit of energy. Do you remember where we left off? Or okay.
Yeah, I need to say something about the mother.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, while he's getting ready there, it kind of went along with, we were talking about the mother, a keen observer of discrimination that he and his friends faced in the field and at home, and this unwavering dedication to the cause of equality, and linked to LULAC. That's powerful stuff, really, you know?
Yeah.
Okay, I think we are good. Go ahead.
Okay, so the mother?
Well, the family was very poor, and they occasionally would go as a family to pick cotton in various places throughout the state. They were migrant farm workers. But the mother was very important, as you can very well imagine. She was a principal caretaker of the children, tended the garden and the animals, but she also took a very important role in educating the children. And she may have been the one who decided that they should move from this little town named Ralitos and move to a nearby larger town that provided educational opportunities for the children. So Jose de Luz Sainz attended an official school, so-called official school, possibly a segregated portion of the school. We don't know, but I believe he also attended a private Mexican school, an independent Mexican school, because he became very proficient in speaking publicly and writing in both English and Spanish. Most of these leaders were like that. They were transitional figures from a primarily Spanish-speaking communities to the 1930s and 40s, when the members of the community began to learn English. And so the leaders not only had to speak in both languages to the community, but they also were speaking to the larger English-speaking community. And so he became proficient in both languages at a very early age, and also excelled to the point that members of a nearby community that were a community of railroad workers asked him to come and teach to their children. The educational system was not developed at all during this period, and in many instances, particularly in the case of Mexican families, they recruited young Mexican-American graduates of local high schools to teach their children. So he started a 40-some-odd-year career as a teacher at the age of about 17 or 18.
Wow.
Near a town called Alice, Texas, in deep South Texas.
Yeah. That would have been such a novel thing to do in the day. I mean, if we ground his time and what he was able to achieve and things like that. And you talk about that unwavering dedication to the cause of equality that you wrote about.
Yeah, well, he was like other civil rights leaders. They grew up very early on with a consciousness. We know, for example, that the people like Alonso Perales was known to stand up in the middle of the cotton rows and plead to the fellow older Mexican cotton pickers to think about getting better jobs and to protest their conditions. I don't have that kind of information on José de Luz Hines, but they were friends very early on, and they shared that commitment to change things. So they were pretty interesting individuals in that they were maturing at a very early age with a sense of political purpose as to be leaders in their community.
Can you give us maybe we can transition a little from World War I, and then in Claiming Rights and Righting Wrongs, in your book, you trace the experiences of Mexican workers on the home front during World War II as they transition from rural to urban areas. And I think a lot of people don't understand about that transition. You know, well, I was in a rural area, now I am in an urban area. Can you give us a little overview of what those collectively, those experiences would be during that time period?
Well, the migration from rural to urban areas meant a lot, not only for Mexican Americans, but African Americans. That's what made it possible for growing numbers of them to get better paying, better skilled jobs in the urban areas. And they were migrating for that very purpose. That is, they understood, they knew that the opportunities for the future generation meant that they had to migrate to urban areas and not only get better paying jobs to provide for their families, but also go to places that could provide their children better educational opportunities. The hope was that future generations could improve their situation. So the Second World War is very important because it helped people in this country recover from the Depression. We come from the hardship of the Depression, and then we enter the 40s. The economy expands to provide important war material like oil, like canvas, machinery, airplanes, and so forth. And that meant better paying jobs. And that's how people recovered. The problem was that the recovery didn't occur at the same rate for everyone. Mexicans were concentrated in agriculture and farming particularly. The chief employer of Mexican men and women was farming. And these are the jobs that involve cotton picking and processing vegetables, for example, were the lowest paid jobs. So there's a constant desire to leave the rural areas, to go to the places like San Antonio, Dallas, and Houston to get better paying jobs. The problem is that they did not leave agriculture at the same rate as white farm workers, for example. They left it at a lower rate, and then when they go to urban areas, discrimination and the higher wage firms prevented them from making that movement all the way into the higher wage jobs. So they left agriculture at a lower rate, and they entered the higher paying jobs in manufacturing at a lower rate. Consequently, they experienced recovery during the Second World War, but the gaps between, say, white workers and Mexican workers in terms of occupational categories and earnings remain relatively unchanged.
I'm thinking of World War II, and you know, Rosie the Riveter, and you were talking about you know, women, and I want to know what role Mexican American women would play during this time out here. Did they have their own kind of segment of Rosie the River job opportunities because it was wartime? And
well, they too experienced in a very general way the general trends, the movement from rural areas to urban areas, growing opportunities, employment opportunities, and making use of these opportunities. Those are the trends that are occurring during the Second World War, and everybody participates in that. My argument in my book is that Mexicans and also African Americans and women do not benefit at the same rate. Women enter in significant numbers into the labor market, in part because the government encourages women to leave the homes and to go into the industrial establishments of manufacturing firms, and they did in great numbers because of that. But when they, so they have a high labor participation rate. beginning around 41, 42, and even 43 and 44. But when the men return, many of these women are replaced, so that they have to return to the homes or to lower paying, lower skilled jobs like secretarial work and laundresses and food processing workers.
Working in kitchens and
Yeah.
things.
And Mexican women have the lowest labor participation rate of all women, as far as I could tell, even lower than African American women. That is, they're moving from agriculture into urban-based, better paying jobs, but they're not moving as fast as Anglo women or white women. They moved into urban areas, but instead of getting these jobs as auto mechanics, for example, in an auto plant in Dallas or Los Angeles, they end up working as janitors, for example. They don't make the full move into the higher wage jobs to the same extent as white women. So that pattern applies generally to Mexicans, but it applies in particular to Mexican women.
I remember, I mean, I've showed my students Rosie the Riveter on several occasions, and you know, one of the things that was talked about in the movie is that women were at the beginning of the story and men were at the end. You'd see all these women with their salami sandwich and milk and making more money than they'd ever made in their whole life, and they were, you know, part of a union. And yet when it came time, all the propaganda that you would see in the films, that what are you going to continue doing this work when your man comes back? No, I'm just warming up the seat for him. I can't wait for him to come back. And there's a lot of description of African Americans going back into the kitchens, and African Americans going to the airports and getting the most menial jobs, you know, when it was all done. And it sounds like that's what you're talking about here.
Well, the film, Rosie the Riveter, captures what I found with regards to Mexican workers generally and Mexican women in particular. But one of the things that is difficult to measure, that some feminist historians have been pointing to, is that these women, in many instances, once they return home, they feel betrayed. And they're very frustrated because they've developed a new psychological outlook on life. They've become relatively independent when they move to a place like Los Angeles, to San Antonio, rent an apartment with other young women that are working in these manufacturing firms. They now have an opportunity to go to public places without being chaperoned. And so they develop a new outlook on life. So now all of a sudden in 45 they're being asked by the very government, as you know, that was recruiting them to work. Now they're telling them, go back home or go back to these older jobs so that the returning servicemen have something waiting for them, so that they can fill these jobs and provide for their families.
Well, they used to give you the women recipes so you could cook something in 20 minutes so you could go to work. The minute the war was over, you do a 7-hour pot roast, so they would keep you in the kitchen. And I mean, the propaganda, as you know, is so much laughable. Like, you know, I'm so happy, I can't wait to get back into the kitchen, and I can't wait for my man to come back. And I'm not, you know, we were doing this for the war effort, and it was a promise made to, you know, the men. And I think that leads to another, you know, it's almost like the feminine mystique with Betty Friedan, that these women had the taste of freedom and liberty and, as you said, independence, and they were making money like they'd never been, you know, had before. And then they had to go back, and the money wasn't there, the respect wasn't there.
And I think that psychological change occurs among Mexicans generally, and the frustration that results from that, I think, contributes to the growing consciousness of an oppressed people into the 50s and 60s. The leadership was real clear about it. The civil rights leadership, particularly in LULAC, made note of the fact they recognized that Mexicans had not recovered from the Depression during the 1940s to the same extent as everybody else. And they pointed to that as their source of frustration with change. And so they began to embrace other methods to challenge discrimination and inequality, including legal challenges against segregation in the workplace and in the schools.
Yeah, You know, you talked about the new types of industrialization, and you know, a lot of that stuff was worsening economic conditions, widespread discrimination, different hostile labor, you know, movement. But one of the things that resonated with me is that you challenge the usual stereotypical depiction of Mexican workers as passive and difficult to organize. Can you talk about that? I mean, that's kind of a major thesis here. A lot of people would say, hey, they, you know, very, very passive kind of resistance here, and you say no.
Well, that's particularly evident that this condition of impoverishment that naturally leads people to conclude that there must be a lack of will on the part of these people who are thoroughly subjected to oppressive conditions. How could they possibly even try to rid themselves of the chains associated with their oppression? But we find that even among the farm workers, the lowly of all the workers, you find that there's continuous efforts to build workers' organizations and to sustain them, and even to protest their conditions through these organizations. This is evident in the 1910s, when Mexicans have this significant number of mutualistas or mutual aid societies, which are actually workers' organizations, and many of them are embracing the workers' rights effort, which involves calling for better wages and so forth. That continues into the 1930s and into the 1940s and 50s. There's a growing participation by Mexican workers in workers' organizations, some of which are independent, in part because the large federations in the early period do not incorporate them. But once the labor federations like the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organization, and the American Federation of Labor begins to open their doors, Mexicans then seek charters and become affiliated as unions within these federations. And so you have a very significant independent workers movement beginning in the 1910s. And then by the 1930s, you see that the CIO in particular increases the number of Mexican members beginning in the 1930s and continuing into the 1940s and 50s.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's really fantastic stories, and I think what I enjoy about all that is that when people have challenges and when there's racism and you know, I think a part of being a historian is having that empathy to kind of live that particular life, and it's not something I would have thought about as a kid, mm-hmm. you know, as a young person, just to understand, you know, this discrimination on the home front or discrimination at work or the achievements that you want to have and the resistance to all that. And also, I think that you did a very good job. I think sometimes we need to pay more attention to some of these economic changes that people, you know, it's like, what did industrialization mm-hmm. do to the, you know, the Mexican worker? What was it like to transition from agrarian agriculture? Mm-hmm. What kind of resistance took place mm-hmm. as people became mobilized and they became, you know, empowered? Mm-hmm. Or looking at the, you know, the diary, I think that is so incredible. I mean, on a lot of different levels. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's great in some ways that people just chronicle what's going on. I mean, someone's detailing the material, but also, you know, the combination of, I said, it could be discrimination, or it can be racism, or it can be hurdles, or just other things that people wouldn't know about. I
think at this point I need to introduce something that I think is very important in the social movements. In these social movements of workers, of women, and immigrants, for example, in the early 1900s and into the 30s and 40s, they not only talk about seeking material gains, like a better paying job in an urban area, they also say a lot about dignity. That is why people begin to talk about their social movements as a movement of equal rights and dignity. And there's plenty of evidence where people are very adamant and profoundly talking about how their sense of worth is being challenged when they're being denied a just wage. It's not just a just wage. It's the sense of being denied one's worth
And respect.
and respect. The word digno, which is closer to the Latin than is dignity, I think says a lot. It's a profound statement, claim of deserving of equal and just treatment, simply because people are human beings. In the Mutualista movement, you see this very moralistic orientation among people. They're not just speaking about the denial of rights, they're also speaking about their sense of worth. And that is what I think partly explains, and to a great extent explains, why these people took to the public square. They went to the public square and they spoke about their concerns. And the concerns are as much about asking to be seen as equals and respected as equals. Much of that comes from the church, but you see that as much as it claims for equal opportunities. And I think that helps explain why it is that even the lowly farm worker, who you would expect would be so defeated at the end of the day without an interest or even energy to do anything for themselves, even they, in their leadership, talk about dignidad, of being digno, of being worth of other people's recognition and respect.
Yeah.
I think that's a very profound term in American history as well as in Mexican history.
Right. I saw, I believe, a blog that you had gotten involved in and wrote, and I thought it was very good, talking about the hubris. Can you talk about what you, kind of in a summation, what you said in that blog? I thought it was very moving.
But the Mutualistas?
No, did you write about that in the blog?
I've written about that.
Yeah, but I think the hubris of
Oh,
yeah, when you wrote that, I was sent, and I read that, and I thought it was very good. And I think we're talking about changing demographics that are happen in the world, and these smug politicians. And
one of the things that comes to mind is that when we study a particular group, you're in effect studying the relationship of that group with other groups. So that when we speak about the sense of self-worth, which is a major driving moralistic idea, you also have to talk about the other person who denies those rights, denies Mexicans the right to be seen as equals. And there is this, I've always been struck by this attitude, of course, of superiority. And it permeates the relations between Mexicans and whites. That is not to say that the Mexicans didn't have their own sense of superiority. In many instances, they felt like as if they were more spiritually above the Americans. That comes from Mexico and other parts of Latin America, that we value, they would say, we value what is really important, and what is important are relationships, as opposed to maintaining the status quo as it is.
Family,
And the Mutualista organizations, which are like the benevolent organizations among other immigrant groups and other minority groups, I think are the ones who really exemplified a lot of these important cultural values that speak well for themselves and speak very harshly about the other. They argued, for example, in many instances, there was one poet by the name of Sarastella Ramirez who once was selected to speak at this very big celebration, the anniversary of a very popular mutual aid organization in Laredo. And he says, Mutualista organizations, benevolent organizations, you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. Because we are by nature, she could have said by God's will, but she was speaking in secular terms. She says, we are by nature good. However, we have a free will. We can go along with the dictates of nature and do for others in a mutualist, reciprocal way, or we go against the brother and the sister, and we contribute to the oppression and to the inequality. We have that choice. And you, the mutualista organizations, have been supporting these cultural values of fraternity, of mutualism, reciprocity, and even altruism. These are the guiding cultural values that are part of this moralistic outlook evident among the working class in American history. And you find it among Mexicans, you find it among whites that are recently arrived from Europe, African Americans, the ones that are going through some very difficult times are having to reach out among themselves to support, to cooperate, otherwise they're not going to survive. And in the process, they reinforce these cultural values that are moralistic and that are intended to help people survive.
Yeah.
And so those working class values continue operating in the labor unions. In unity there is strength. That's a mutualist statement.
Sure, absolutely.
And it continues with the feminists, and it continues with other folks into the 30s and the 40s and so forth.
Good. Well, I think I just have a couple wind-up questions for you today, and I believe that you and I had a phone conversation about, they called them greasers, and I think if I got this right, about Mario Garcia with a review, and I think you had a very different kind of take, and I think this kind of comes full circle for me. But I've been very moved by, they called them greasers, because I'm interested in the first contact and the first question that was asked in the book. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but the gist of it is, if Anglos had never met Tejanos, why do they find them, abominable, and where does this negativity, where does this racism come? What would you say about what did the book mean to you? Is this an opening when, and I believe, but you start with the Mexican other. That's where you had to be, and this was way before critical race theory as this new discipline, but just kind of saying, hey, listen, what's interesting to me is that if I say something about you, Mexicans are lazy, it's not me just describing somebody, but it's describing what I'm not. I'm a Puritan, hardworking, working 12 hours a day, and Mexicans work 3 hours a day, and they can't wait to get to the gaming table, and they put a food on the table. I mean, that was in the first beginnings out there. How do you read that book?
They call them Greasers as a book authored by Arnoldo de Leon, and in it he documents numerous instances in which Anglo persons describe Mexicans in very pejorative terms that we call racist. There's disdain in the language. That is why we call it racist. The book has never been effectively challenged. It stood its ground. In other words, the issue of racist thought and racial discrimination was established beyond a shadow of a doubt. In other words, he documents so many instances of discrimination and racial prejudice extending from the 1800s into the early 1900s to the point that nobody's ever disputed that. I would want to add something that is very important. Arnoldo de Leon, when he has to explain where all this comes from, he talks about how people are inheriting these pejorative views of the Mexican that come from the period of the wars in Texas, the Mexican-American War, the Texas secessionist movement of 1836. And he also talks about how people projected views they had developed over time in their relationships with African Americans in the Deep South. But scholars have added something else, and David Montejano has done this. I have done it as well as historians, and that is some of these ideas emerge naturally from new situations of competition and conflict, where unequal relations naturally breed racist ideas that the people in power use to maintain their power. And let me give you an example which I think is very illustrative of what happens. When developers came into deep South Texas and began to convert ranch land into farmland, they hired Mexicans to clear the land, level the land, build irrigation systems. In the process, they get investors to help establishing the irrigation systems, which was formidable. And they then advertise these small, medium-sized farms that are being sold at very high price, inflated prices. They advertise them in the Midwest. So you find Midwestern farmers. You can imagine the farmer and the family sitting down at the dinner table and saying, look, here's this great opportunity to go to South Texas. They've got great soils. They have a great irrigation system. The farms are already surveyed and leveled out and ready. They have great climate, and they have low-wage Mexican workers. That's what they're advertising. They're guaranteeing that we will be successful farmers because we're going to, as business people say in modern times, they have these inputs that guarantee success. So they come to South Texas with that in mind. And in some instances, you have to give credit to these Midwestern farmers that they may have wanted to buck the system and maybe pay a better wage to these poor workers that are being thoroughly exploited. But they can't do it. They've entered a cultural system with cultural scripts that dictate that they need to go along with. Not only does it benefit them economically to pay low wages, but they have to go along with the understandings about race relations. So, what does this tell us? It tells us that racial prejudice and racial discrimination emerges naturally from these kinds of conditions. The other thing that is probably more profound is that it tells us that good people from the Midwest who had no experience in these racialized relationships very quickly accommodated themselves into this, suggesting that any one of us under these circumstances can become racist. And this is one of the lessons in a racialized history. People learn not only that they can be exploited and that race can be used to justify the exploitation, but they also learn about the demons involved in this kind of arrangement. And when you put that alongside the very moralistic outlook that people have in life, the fact that they have to model the right behavior in front of their children, you can see how they also learn how not to be with other people. So this question of dignity then gets reinforced. We are worth something not only because God has intended us to be seen as equals, but we are acting appropriately.
Yeah.
So I think the lesson in history, history that is racialized, one lesson is that people learn how not to be. And for us as readers of that history, we need to take that to heart. That is, we ought not to see this history as being something beneath us. We're all subject to these influences, and we in the present have a responsibility to correct whatever problems we see that are vestiges from that racist past. Otherwise, we become also we also contribute to that problem. You know, this is an issue that was raised at the Nuremberg trials when the German officers took the defense that they did what they did because they were ordered to do it. That's true, but we all have ultimately the responsibility to make decisions that speak to the correct way of dealing with other people.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the lesson and that's one way to break out of this morass of racial prejudice and discrimination in the past, one way to get out of it, to come out of it, step back, is by learning that lesson, that we're all subject to that influence to become that way with our fellow human being.
I think that is such a wonderful place to cut it there. I think that was really, really fantastic that the lessons, we
Well,
learned.
yeah, and it's true. It's true. And this is what I tell people when I testify at the legislature. This is not a question of blaming people. It's a question of setting things right, which involves also learning how not to be.
Yeah, I think that as well. I think Anders said something along the same line. He said it wasn't to kind of go back and start saying and blame. We're talking about the critical race theory, or somebody saying, hey, we're going to tell these kids what the great grandfathers had done. I use the example of the comfort girls, and in mostly Koreans from Japan. I mean, people mostly know this anyway, but this concept of addressing things, not to put blame on people. And Frank de la Terre, he had a very interesting kind of take on reparations for an institution that happened a long time ago. Like, why would we have reparations on people today for something that you're being responsible? It wasn't about blaming people, but it's kind of learning about people. And I think another thing that I've just learned is the threat that fear is an incredible motivator for people. I think if you tell white people that the demographics are changing, and there's going to be white genocide, and pretty soon everybody will speak Spanish, and the browning of America, and we hear this. I mean, there's a lot of fear going on, and I said this to Anders, but I was just paraphrasing it, but it stayed with me about LBJ talking about you can always pick up a man's pocket if you just give somebody beneath him. It doesn't mean you take a poor white guy, you say, well, you're not a slave, and then you steal his money, or it doesn't matter where, as long as in that hierarchy there's someone beneath you, or you just try to tell people an immigrant's taking your job. You don't rail against corporate America. It's that migrant who's doing that.
It almost seems like as if they're speaking to, in this case, Mexican Americans, and putting them in a position where they have to deny the possibility that they would become revolutionaries, and so that they're already preparing them to become collaborators with the state.
Sure.
That's what they're doing, and that's why we see Mexican Americans emerging as very conservative political players, because they understand the message. They're being told, look, we fear this possibility, so you need to go in a different direction. That's what they're telling people, and it works.
Oh, yeah.
I think that there's going to be one of the big problems for Mexican Americans in the next century, perhaps, the rest of the century, is that there's going to be a growing number of Mexican Americans that become very conservative and maybe even reactionaries. We're already seeing it.
Yeah.
And I think it has to do with this patriotic response to this fear expressed against Mexicans. I'm not like them. You don't have to fear me. I think that's happening.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I mean, not funny, but peculiar. Your wife is perhaps more optimistic than I am about the future, and said that the Republicans, they're dead in the water. They got nothing, anymore. It's not that I disagree. I totally do. But I'm hearing the discussions of Trump 2024, and I'm starting to see the people come out for him, and I see the polarization that's still taking place in America. I don't know necessarily that the Republican Party need anything except white supremacy and racism to sustain themselves.
We win battles, and it's good to think that we're winning the war too. We're winning the hearts of many people, especially young people, I think. But they're formidable, and they've got an attitude. like in your face. I mean, we got the power, we're exercising it, and we don't care what you think
Well,
about the Constitution or.
I've looked at a lot of the marches, and I sent Jim a couple of the videos of that. You know, Jews will not replace us. Jews will not replace us. We're here. You'll never, you know, go out there. The Klan, the people that are involved in it. I mean, to me, which is so absurd. I cannot imagine, you know, in my lifetime seeing anybody storm the Capitol and like it's no big deal. You know, you
with
would
Confederate flags and with
Confederate
anti-Semitic statements
in front of John C. Calhoun with the Confederate flag and the people. I as a kid couldn't understand during the time of John Fitzgerald Kennedy or LBJ that a whole bunch of people stormed the Capitol and it's like, hey, we don't care, or Trump really did win the election and stop the steal. And I mean that kind of scares the hell out of me moving forward. And that's why I don't know that I'm as you know, I was like, wow, is that really?
But we have to be hopeful.
Sure.
We have to be hopeful.
Yeah.
Even despite all of that, because otherwise, you know, what was the song? Well, anyway, we have to remain hopeful.
Right.
And you know, let me tell you, when we go to the state legislature and we hear these nonsensical statements by people that are unfounded, ungrounded, but it's just pure emotion. And it's happening at the school board meetings, and you try to reason with them, but you're just speaking past each other.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I mean, you know, I saw you when you were making a discussion, and you were. I mean, it was, you know, very articulate and well. That's my fear, you know, when facts don't matter to people. As you said, if someone's coming up with raw emotion and it's not based on anything.
You know that the author of that so-called anti-critical race theory fellow, I mean, I've been testifying against him, and I was not in agreement with everybody else that were saying, because the bill really is not on the surface the threat that people say it is. Yes, there's intent, but it's not overtly stated on the surface. So I've been looking for the so-called legislative intent of the author. He didn't provide one, but I found some stuff. He wrote a letter to all the members of the Texas legislature. And he says, you need to join this and support and become co-authors. And then he gave the reasons, the intent, the justification. And he said, little white boys and girls are being made to feel guilty, basically for the sins of the fathers. And that's creating all kinds of problems. And that explains the growing suicide rate. That's not true. That is not true. That's pretty serious. When we start saying kids are killing themselves because they're being told that they're to blame for racial oppression.
Well, I think your wife responded in a certain sense. So there's that on the one side, so what we should do is negate all the other atrocities and the racism, because we can't tell that story. What we do is we have to appease the people that say we don't want to feel bad, or we don't want to hear about our past, or we don't want to do any of that stuff. This is a little off subject, but I think it's kind of interesting. But the Philadelphia Eagles just whooped Detroit, and at the end they were all sharing jerseys, swapping jerseys, and signing and all this kind of stuff. And Michael Strahan, just said there was never, when you got an ass whooping like that, you had pride. You don't keep the coach waiting. You go out there. But he says, it's like, it doesn't really matter that we lost, and it wasn't a loss. It was a slaughter. And I'm a big football fan. I'm a Ram fan for 50 years. But those kinds of things, and it's just like an interesting kind of world where the things that we was like, I can disagree with you, and I can be an intellectual in you, and we can just come up with different reasons about certain things. But if that's not part of your arsenal, You're not using reason. You're not doing
Yeah.
intellect. You're not being a critical thinker. You're just going on, hey, you know what? Kids are committing suicide because they're made to feel, and then people jump on that kind of stuff.
And it's not true.
And it's, yeah.
By the way, I didn't get a chance to say something about Jose La Luz that I think is important. His major contribution, where he says we're making the ultimate sacrifice in the battlefield so that future generations can take this sacrifice to support their claim for equal rights. That's being visionary.
Oh, yeah. I know this, I'm getting a little...
Stick it in there if you can.
Yeah. I think one of the things that is weird when you start to feel other people's lives and it starts to affect you. And I was telling your wife, it's not things that happened to me, but just to, you know, this is off, but I show this kind of film where African-American couple have money to buy a house. And so they come up and they said, we'd like to buy a house. And the guy said, yes, let's get you an application. And they have the money, they meet all the requirements. So the couple fill it out. And the guy says, well, thank you very much. We'll be in touch. And then he takes it and he crumples it up and he throws it in the trash can. That's not a personal thing for me. It's not like I've ever been discriminated against that. So why does that elicit something in me where I say, my God, so here you're the couple thinking, that was a big deal, my wife and I, do we get the house, are we gonna get this? And I'd rather somebody be openly racist to me and said, you got no chance in hell.
You know what it is? Well, first of all, you value what I have to say and others, but it's ancestral knowledge that's operating inside you. You're not far removed from working class origins, maybe when they're 2 generations.
Yeah.
Immigrant experience. I mean, I think when we're growing up, we hear stories that our parents heard when they were children, and those ideas and sentiments get transferred to the point where we're not conscious of it, but they're operating in the cell structure and a memory somehow. We carry memory so profoundly.
Yeah. Well,
So to what we don't know where it comes from. I think there's something to ancestral knowledge that we all carry these memories, pieces of memory about the hardship, about the difficulties, the challenges. We all do that. All of us. Some of us may be farther removed than others, but we all carry that.
Yeah.
The working class experience is a very general experience for people in this country.
I'm an aristocrat, though. You know, I have no working. No, but but you know, one of the things I think my mother, and I would put this on her. I think my mother gave me manners, and I come up with the idea that manners, if you really have manners, you have to be open to what other people are going through, or you can't look after them. It's not just being, I have to see that somebody out here doesn't have something to eat. Yeah. I have to be aware of the greater world.
Well, that's a context for manners, teaching manners. Manners don't feed themselves. They gotta be grounded.
You gotta look. You gotta be aware of what other people. Because if you see someone hungry and it doesn't matter to you, then you're not going to go. When you say, oh my God, you know, geez, you know, here's something here. You're lonely. Someone's in the corner. Someone needs, you know, just wants to talk.
But you do carry ancestral knowledge. Even if it wasn't there a generation, 2 generations ago, your generations have had dealings with people that carry that knowledge.
Yeah.
And that have influenced your family. But anyway, you know, I mean, I'm not far removed from all these experiences, but let me tell you, I know people that are not far removed like myself and don't think like me.
Oh yeah, that's for.
I mean, for sure. I've got this ongoing battle with this woman that graduated 2 years after I did in my high school, and she's so super patriotic to the point of being dumb about things. I mean, she's horrible, and I take her on, and then all of a sudden there's a fellow Mexican American former classmate of mine who say, "Oh, come on, man, let's be friends. I mean, don't let politics ruin our relationships."
Well, you know, there's certain things I think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There are certain things you can disagree about, and there's other things I can't disagree about. And I had one of my former high school students. She's a teacher, like a 3rd grade, and there was somebody put on a video. Send the clowns, you know, send the clowns in, and it was a really great take, and it was all the people like, and it said the clowns are already here. I mean, it was a somebody sent it. I didn't post it, but it was and it was really, it showed like Trump's golden toilet and all the losers that were all in jail, and she wrote that on Facebook or something like that. Where did you study? Why do you look? I mean, she was appalled that I thought the video was funny, and she's teaching third graders, and I guess I do have quite a following of my students, and basically was accusing me of indoctrinating my students with some of my students dropped me. We're not around, and a couple people have defriended me or unfriended me or whatever because of what my opinion is. I used to put things like a picture of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln, and that picture of Trump dressed up as a clown, and then write something, and you want to know why I can't let it go. It's...
Well, let me tell you, my Facebook friends, I keep relationships with my high school classmates, and I've got, I mean, these people are like sons and daughters of immigrants who went through hell. I knew their parents. Good working people, but man, were they exploited and treated so horribly. And they're blind to that. It happened in their lives. They were children when that shit was happening to their parents. I remember.
Yeah.
We had a little grocery store, so people would come, poor people buy groceries, so we knew all these families. We knew all of them, and these people, they're sons and daughters of exploited immigrants in many cases. But I don't know. I mean, I think we failed to reach them.
I think it's interesting, a point that you brought up, because I know a lot of people that have been discriminated against, Mexican Americans, and how they become very, very right wing, and trying to figure out where is that path. I have a British friend. He's his old time friend, and very working class and everything. Support all the people that don't give a toss about working class people. What is it that you think this person is doing for you as a working class person? I don't understand. This person's not looking after you. Check what kind of tax refund you got.
Well, I always wonder why these people get to be that way. Who knows? But it's almost like self-denial, self-hatred in some instances, and I think it goes real deep. It's also self-serving, but who knows?
That's an interesting part to talk about. Self-serving.
But the point is that you can't spend your time trying to get into other people's heads. You just got to move on.
Well, I had to learn that kind of the hard.
Well,
it didn't come straight away, because I would get in there. I have one former student, and he caused a major uproar, but he would take so he's African American, and he's writing up that in no way is Trump a racist, which to me is absolutely laughable. And somebody else, he attacked, I don't think he realized, and he ripped into my brother. My brother had jumped on the conversation with me, and then he ripped into another college professor, and I had to pull the plug on him. He's a real, he